seminar, what we call Making Sense of the Intertwined Biosphere. It's hosted by the Anthropocene Laboratory here at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And yeah, my name is Henrik Österblom. I have the privilege to be the director of the Anthropocene Laboratory. And the speakers that you will listen to in a few moments, they have been here for a couple of days of a workshop where we're trying to make sense of this intertwined biosphere. Just a short, if you're not familiar with the Anthropocene Laboratory, our mission is really to advance conversation on sustainability by bridging scientific disciplines, by working across the natural and social sciences and the humanities, by working with artists, and by really trying to figure out, what does all this sustainability challenges mean, and what, if anything, could we do about it? And the public seminar that we're organizing is an opportunity for us to engage with you and engage in a wider community of thinking about how to co-create change. So you can see our mission here, and really the method is really to engage in these respectful dialogues, really try to make sure that we listen and that we really try to understand each other, despite the fact that we may have very different backgrounds and origins. So again, the seminar is on the biosphere, and the biosphere is this thin layer of life in which all of us exist. All our past and present and future relationships takes place in the biosphere. And when you speak about the intertwined biosphere, it's a little bit like speaking about everything. So of course that's a challenge. But I think the speakers here today will tell you a little bit about this everything from very different perspectives, and the point is to get you inspired and to trigger a conversation. And of course, please contact us afterwards if you have questions that you weren't able to raise here, or have other ideas or suggestions or opinions, or want to engage with us in other ways. And again, this is a fourth seminar that we hosted here. And the first seminar took place in November of last year. It was a seminar we called the Empirics of Hope, and that was also paralleled with a scientific conversation about hope that we hosted the days prior to that. We talked about sort of the ways in which we can understand hope, and to what extent there is reason to be hopeful about the future of humanity moving into more of a sustainable space. We had scholars from all over the world, from the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And we were also very excited to have American author Rebecca Solnit online with us. A bit of a global authority on hope, if you will. But if you're not familiar with her, I could really recommend her work. In February of this year, we hosted our formal inauguration. We have featured artwork by Norwegian visual artist Tone Bjordam and by Swedish composer Jacob Milrad, and we gave a few short presentations on our big ambitions on what we want to achieve here at the laboratory. Empirics of Hope is one of those big sort of topics that we're exploring, and this intertwined biosphere is this other big topic that we are exploring. And then thirdly, we hosted a seminar together with a number of other organizations last week with Canadian journalist Naomi Klein. And she spoke a lot about the mirror images of social media, and she also spoke very eloquently about the mirror images of our enemy and the ones that we don't know, and the other, as perhaps an indication that we should look closer at ourselves. And looking at the biosphere is, of course, a way to look at ourselves. And one can ask oneself, who is it that we're looking at when we're watching the cherry blossoms, or when we're smelling the lilacs in the street? Of course, again, when you think about all those beautiful experiences that you have when you're just outside this room and experiencing spring, it makes you think about life, but it also makes you think about fragility and death. And it also makes you think about the necessity to walk with care and to pay attention, and really being mindful of spending one's time in a way that you really feel you can represent. So again, I'm super happy that you are here. And we want to talk a little bit more about all these perspectives of nature. This strange word in the English language that is separating from us. It's something else, something other. And it's one could ask themselves, why is it so difficult to sort of feel and act as the intertwined, entangled beings that we really are? For many of us, at least, and many cultures, this is something that we perhaps have forgotten, this intertwinedness. And even though you can feel it intensely at times, it's also difficult to carry it with you at all times. And why is that? And can we help each other understand and sense this more appropriately? So today, we're going to first listen to Stockholm-based artist duo Goldin and Seneby. They will talk about the entire human history when seen through a tree. We will listen to Ron Milo, who's done some amazing calculations on the relationship between humans and all other animals and plants on this planet. We will listen to Eva Jablonka, who will talk about memory in cells and animals and humans and how it's carried forward across generations. And we will hear from Esteban Yubaji, who will talk about only the entire continent of South America and its history. So that will be followed by a panel participating with Ariane König, Belinda Reyes, and Carl Folke. And they will talk about how this intertwined perspective has been integrated in science, policy, and business, and what remains to be done in order to really integrate these perspectives. So that's a bit of the background. But before we begin, I want to read a little text by Jorge Luis Borges. He's an Argentinian author. He was never awarded the Nobel Prize, possibly because he was, people associated with political opinions that he did not have. He was an anti-communist and an anti-fascist, and he wrote beautifully about infinity. So if you're interested in everything, Borges that's the place to go. But he also wrote about the disconnection between humans and the disconnection that could be. So after this text is something he wrote after the war on the Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. And this is a war he referred to as a war between two bold men over a comb. So the text, I think, is equally relevant today, many years later, given of course, the many armed conflicts in the world, but also because of this topic that we're talking about, this relationships that we perhaps don't have the way we should have. And sometimes we talk about humans killing nature or nature killing humans, but isn't it more about how can we understand and work with this relationship? Because what's at stake now is so much more than a comb. So the text, much like many of his texts, are about that long. So bear with me now when I read Juan Lopez and John Ward in English. Sorry, not the original Spanish, but I'm sure you can find it if you're interested. They lived in a strange age. The planet had been partitioned into different countries, each armed with loyalties, cherished memories, and an unquestionable heroic past, with laws, grievances, and their own peculiar mythologies, with bronze busts of great men, anniversaries, demagogues, and symbols. This division, the labor of cartographers, was good for starting wars. Lopez was born in the city by the motionless river. Ward in the outskirts of the city once walked by Father Brown. He had studied Spanish in order to read Don Quixote. The other professed the love of Conrad, who had been revealed to him in a classroom on Viamonte Avenue. They might have been friends, but they only saw each once, face to face, somewhere down in those two famous islands, and each of them was Cain, each Abel. They were buried together, decayed in the snow. These events took place in an age we cannot understand. So these events took place in an age we cannot understand. So we're trying to make some sense of this age that to some of us is very difficult to understand, and we try to understand how we can avoid this failure of relationships. So with that, I would like to welcome Simon and Jacob from the artist duo Goldin and Seneby, who will give us the history of humanity in a tree. Please give them a warm welcome.
Hi, my name is Jakob Senneby.
And I'm Simon Golden, and the two of us work together as Golden and Senneby.
Before we begin this presentation, I just wanted to mention that we will be reading from a script, as you can already see. I have a neurological condition which makes it difficult for me to keep a coherent thread if I were to speak freely. And Simon has a condition which makes it difficult for him to stop speaking.
Today we want to tell you the story of Spruce Time, a public artwork that we've been working on since 2018 and that is scheduled to be inaugurated at a hospital in Malmö next year. It's a work which we imagine could come to circulate as a story or a hearsay, as someone saying, "Did you know that the world's oldest tree has been hospitalized in Malmö?"
The tree in this story is a small spruce on the mountain in Dalarna, known as Old Chico. Some of you might have heard of it. It has survived through the millennia by cloning itself.
Our presentation today is an attempt to tell the prehistory of Spruce Time while still in the making. We start with the prehistory of the tree.
The first known human depiction of trees is almost 10,000 years old. They can be found on cave walls in what is today northeastern Brazil. The tree appears to be elements in some form of ritual, people dancing beneath the branches, carrying trees, worshipping them.
10,000 years ago, this part of the world where we live had just emerged from under the melting glaciers of the most recent ice age. As you know, this epoch, since the last ice age, is referred to as Holocene.
At the very same time as people in northeastern Brazil were dancing around trees and drawing them on walls in their sacred caves, a spruce took root in the Fulefjell Mountains in northwestern Dalarna.
This spruce has lived through essentially all of Holocene. It survived nearly 3,000 years of the warm Atlantic period, when woods were leafy, grapes were growing all the way up into Dalarna, and hazelnuts up into northern Norrland. The image you see is a 6,000-year-old pollen grain from wild grapevines.
The spruce has lived through the birth of all known human cosmologies that imagine trees as a symbol of life and fertility, and a carrier of cosmic order. The tree as that which connects the sky, the earth, and the underworld. The tree of life recurs in various forms, in the Garden of Eden, as the world tree Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, the Wakachan in Mayan mythology, as a banyan tree beneath which Buddha is enlightened, and as the origins of the first two humans in Zoroastrian cosmology.
But the same spruce has also survived through the cold Fimbul winter in the year 536, described in Norse mythology as an unequivocal sign of Ragnarök, the end of the world. And has lived through the even colder Little Ice Age, when humans experienced the global climate crisis with recurring crop failures, mass starvations, epidemics, and wars. This painting is from 1658 and shows the frozen sea between Sweden and Denmark when the Swedish army invades.
In more recent Swedish cultural history, the spruce holds long-standing ritual meaning and has played a central role in the Nordic folklore. Today's Christmas trees has its predecessor in so-called julstänger, or Christmas poles, spruce branches attached to poles placed outside the home to ward off evil spirits, as you can see in the image. And up until about a century ago, it was customary to line the funeral processions route to the cemetery with spruce trees, their tops broken in the direction of the church in order for the spirit of the dead one not to turn around.
In her project, The Swedish Series, the artist Ann Butcher compiles Swedish cultural references to the spruce tree over the past 400 years. Through her work, one can follow how the spruce went from being loathed during the late Baroque period, it did not fit with the leafy French landscape ideals of the era, to becoming a central symbol in 19th century national romantic painting and burgeoning Swedish nationalism of the time.
During the 20th century, a brighter image of the spruce also emerges in everything from children's stories by Elsa Beskow to the outdoor schools in the 1970s known as the Mulleskola.
The forest and the spruce are also central motifs in the writings of Harry Martinson and Sara Lidman. When Lidman in the 1980s publishes a collection of political essays, it is titled And the Tree Answered, och trädet svarade. The collection takes as a point of departure a passionate love story when Lidman, as a 5-year-old, is chosen by a spruce that initiates her into a universe of wordless relations.
It is this deep history of a wordless universe that we are calling spruce time. The spruce that took root in Fulefjell Mountain nearly 10,000 years ago has survived over the course of millennia, essentially through the entire Holocene, by repeatedly cloning itself.
So the spruce you see in this image is only a few hundred years old, but parts of its root system were found to be 9,550 years old. The theory is that snow weighing down the lower branches during wintertime has pressed some of them into the ground, and every few hundred years a new, genetically identical tree takes root.
But as some people suggest, many of you which are here today, Holocene could already have come to an end. And we could be at the brink of a new geological epoch, frequently referred to as Anthropocene, or human time, which might or might not threaten this spruce's ability to continue cloning itself. A touring theatre production based on the writings of Harry Martinson and the fictional death of Old Chico in 2019 thematized this scenario.
But a more imminent threat to Old Chico and its survival on Fulefjället is probably its fame. There are several coffee table books that document and tell the story of this tree. Recently a children's book, endless selfies, and numerous tourist guides, like this YouTube channel Husbilsresor och Äventyr, Caravan Trips and Adventures, live streaming from the world's oldest tree. All of which has made it a considerable tourist destination, which some say threatens its root system and long-term survival.
So, here, in an image of historical continuity, we're still dancing around the mythical tree.
So far, background. This is where we intervene in the story. With the help of the Forest Research Institute, Skogforsk, we gathered small twigs from the top branches of the tree.
Because the tree is so old and the spray gathered is so small, they cannot be planted directly as cuttings, but first need to be grafted onto the stem of another tree. 36 twigs from Old Chico were grafted onto other trees, and after a year, half of them have survived.
Old Chico on Fulefjället is already a clone of itself. It is the genetic individual rather than the tree on the mountain that is 10,000 years old. And now, these clones are the same genetic individual. What we are looking at here is the oldest tree in the world at the very beginning of its life. Spruce time enters the epoch of human time.
Now we come to the hospitalization of the tree. We developed spruce time for the new hospital grounds in Malmö, and the hospital itself is integral to the work. The hospital both has an infrastructure of care and as an institution of normative violence, inherent in defining what is healthy and sick, physically and biologically desirable or not, and which treatments should be prioritized and at what cost.
The spruce will have its own care building, a computer-controlled greenhouse attached to the hospital's existing cooling system, where the needs of the tree determine the climate, in terms of light, temperature, water and humidity, gas exchange, etc. The greenhouse becomes a customized miniature hospital responsible for the care of this single life.
And it's also important to us that the climate control of the care building operates via the infrastructure of the hospital and uses excess cooling capacity of the hospital to cool the tree. These diagrams show how the tree chamber is integrated with the hospital's climate system. For us, this work is primarily about dependencies, about making the world's oldest tree dependent on the ecology of the hospital, and making the hospital a part of the tree's ecology.
For someone making their way across the hospital grounds, spruce time constitutes a visual analogy to the hospital itself. But the piece also offers a space for contemplation in the middle of a busy passageway, a place where one can encounter a tree and follow its development over the course of a lifetime. Whosoever desires can enter the greenhouse, sit on a bench that surrounds the tree, and take part in the tree's climate. Perhaps new parents will want to conduct a naming ceremony around the tree. Perhaps a 5-year-old, like the young Sara Lidman, will fall in love with the spruce. Perhaps it can become a place where a nurse gathers strength before giving a death notice, or where a patient sits while waiting for their transport service.
While spruce time can also circulate as the hearsay of someone saying, "Did you know that the world's oldest tree has been hospitalized in Malmö?"
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Simon and Jacob. This is a spectacular project. We're going to have a few minutes for questions after the first of 4 speakers. So with that, please welcome Ron Milo from the Weizmann Institute of Science.
So hello everyone. In the minutes that I have, I want to share with you a concrete example that I hope will show how it's not only me that spent these last few days here in the Anthropocene lab, but actually how we are all being in an Anthropocene lab in our life right now in the intertwined biosphere. And I hope that through the rigor of science we could see how that is really observed and measured. And so to make to get us started, so we're going to do a census of life on Earth where we try to weigh all the living things in the biosphere. You can think about a concrete example. Let's say we want to weigh the weight of all of humanity. So it's actually composed of 2 parts. You can look at what's the weight of a person multiplied by the number of people, and again you get the overall weight, right? So the weight of a person, that's relatively easy. It's about 50 kilograms, right? Yeah, so I was looking forward to your smiles. So how come we arrive at 50 kilograms? It's not because of some extreme diets that we're having, but it's really about looking at overall humanity. We have adults as well as children. We take the average, we get about 50 kilograms. Each one of us is about 2/3 water, and out of the remaining dry mass, half of us is carbon. We'll be talking in carbon units, as you'll see in a minute. And therefore, each one of you, if you didn't know it or not, on average, you're about 10 kilograms of carbon. You can multiply it by the number of people. So recently, the 8 billionth child was born on Earth. So if we take the order of magnitude, we're talking about 10 to the 10 or 10 billion people. We're heading there anyway. You multiply the 2 numbers, and you see that we're each, as humanity, we're about 0.1 gigaton of carbon. Okay, tons, and giga is like 10 to the 9, kind of like the units that a billion, like how we measure, say, memory in our cell phones. Okay, so that would be kind of like the units we'll be working on, gigatons of carbon. And as you can see, the analysis is not complicated. So you might say we could have done all of this ourselves. The point is that doing it for humanity is something relatively straightforward, but if you want to do it for all of life, it becomes somewhat more challenging. Actually, you can't even find almost any other example where you could do that. For example, say you want to do it for insects. If you want to do it for insects, you need to know the number of insects and the characteristic weight of an insect. Well, yeah, it's very difficult to find any person who could give you a value on that, especially given that they could range over millions of fold in terms of between the lightest and the weightest. So much bigger range. So what do you do anyway if you still want to build a census of life and see the impacts of humanity? You have to break down the problem into components. So let me give you a concrete example. This is the toughest slide in my presentation. Let's say you want to know the weight of all the fish in the oceans. Okay, how do you go about that? So you can start by fishing the literature. Okay, you can collect all the available data, and people have been studying fish for quite a while in different locations in the oceans, different times of the year, and have been measuring that. The problem is, what about all the other locations at which we didn't go and measure that? How do you find values for that? So for that, we're trying to find correlates between the measurements that we have and all sorts of environmental parameters in that are out there. So what kind of environmental parameters would you say could be relevant, correlated with how much biomass you have or how much fish you have at a given location? Any suggestions? I hear something from far.
Temperature.
Okay, so temperature is great. What else?
Depth.
The depth of the ocean, fantastic.
Nutrients.
The nutrients content. Okay, so we're getting engagement here. That's good. So we're making progress. So I agree with you. These are the sort of things we'd like to look at in terms of environmental parameters. And once we have those, we could find all sorts of correlations. I'm showing here like a linear correlation, but it could be all sorts of fancy mathematical, statistical approaches that we'll be applying. Once we have those, we're at a much better location because, friends at, NASA and other places have been mapping those environmental parameters throughout the globes, throughout the days of the year. And so with that, armed also with the mathematical relationship, we could infer for each and every other location. We could extrapolate what should be the weight of fish, or everything that's left is just to integrate all of that, get a global estimate, which is what we were looking for. And what's the next step? Then we have to repeat all of this exercise again and again, because in science, it's as important to know not just the number, but how certain you are about it. So you want to get some uncertainty range to know how confident we could be in our estimate. So this is what we're doing in doing those census of life. And with that, we could go back to the result. So let's say I was asking you when we say taxon, meaning which group of living things weighs the most on Earth.
Plants.
So let's give some options to make it democratic. So if you needed to vote, would you say it's A, bacteria, B, fungi, C, plants, or D, viruses? The question is clear. I'm weighing all of those groups, and I'm saying who weighs the most.
Plants.
Okay, so let's do the quick vote. Who's voting for bacteria? Okay, I see about half of voting for bacteria. Who's voting for fungi? Wow, a third, I would say, voting for fungi. Who's voting for plants? I would say another third. We're above 100%. D, viruses. Okay, we have also somebody for viruses. Good. So first of all, I could see that, you're a very pluralistic society. You're supporting basically, more than 100% of the options. That's very good. I would also say that most of you are wrong, which is also actually a good indication because I find that usually when I'm wrong, that means that I have an opportunity to learn something new. So that's fine. And also I would finally also reflect, I've been giving that in other places, even though most of you are wrong. Say when I gave that talk in Princeton, probably one of the best departments in the world in ecology, they were more wrong than you are. So you can rest assured you're in a respectable place. And just finally, in order to build some drama, when I gave this talk in my daughter junior high school, they taught me that in order to build some drama, before I show the next slide, you can do something like this, like make some noise. Okay, great participation. Okay, so, okay, I see some people really happy in the audience. Well done. So really about 90% of the living things on Earth are plants. Myself coming from the Department of Plant and Environmental Sciences, it's good for us. But it's really by far the first place. And if you want to look at bacteria are in the very respectable second place. So they're also obviously, and all components here are relevant and important, but I think in terms of us having a holistic view of the world, especially in the Anthropocene, but in general, I think we should have those sort of things that I would say, given that they told me it's a very intelligent audience, I think it's an interesting reflection on the education system, etc., how these basic properties of our intertwined biosphere are not something that are common knowledge to us. Okay, there's a lot more I could tell you about this, and we've been studying from all sorts of different angles, but the time is pressing in terms of what I have, but also because of the Anthropocene upon us. So then let me move from here to just showing you an overall picture of what we're talking about. So if you want us to put us in perspective, so you can see humanity up there. This is really cool. So you can see humanity here versus the viruses, the worms, the fish, etc. And to put us in the real perspective versus the fungi, bacteria, and plants, we're supposed to be this size up here. Okay, so we're like a tiny fraction. You can see it also here. We're about 0.01% overall in comparison to the other things, which to me begs the question on what is the impact of humanity, this small dot in the overall mass of things, on all the other things. And we could take a concrete example, and that is the very charismatic thing known as mammals, which are very close to us. And we were asking, let's take in that concrete example, what is the relationship between the weight of all the wild mammals, all those featuring in all the BBC documentaries, etc., versus the domesticated mammals, those we grow and eat, etc. What's the ratio between them? So this is what my student Lior Grinspoon did during her PhD, or still doing. And you can see here the most updated results that we got. So you can see here in green, that's all of the terrestrial mammals, meaning all the wild mammals living on land combined would be these green ones. You can see, for example, one of the polygons there, that would be all the elephants. In blue, you can see all the wild marine mammals. Okay, all the whales, dolphins, seals, etc. And in red, you can see the livestock. In orange, you can see us. So from that, for example, you can see that, say, even if you just take all the sheep in the world, there'll be more than all the land mammals combined. You can see a breakdown into that, but I see the time is pressing. We also spend a lot of time to take our science and to make it such that people could also connect to that. So for example, you can see the overall result, about only 6% of wild mammals mass on Earth now is wild, where all the rest is, as you understand, as you can see in the proportions here, us and our livestock. And you can also study the dynamics of this. So this is a study still in the making. So this is between 1850 and today. What has happened to the weight of mammals on Earth? And you can see that from a situation where the majority was wild, we've been transitioning pretty rapidly in recent history into the highly dominated human and livestock mammal biomass. And so, I have 3 daughters at home, and my youngest one, I still read to her bedtime stories from time to time. And I don't know how it is in Sweden, but back home, when most of the stories, they talk about, say, like an elephant or like a lion that wants to have a haircut, and he goes to the something like a zebra that helps with the haircut, and they have some other mammal appearing there. And these are the stories I tell her, but being a serious scientist, want to tell her the most updated scientific evidence, it usually is supposed to be something like a cow going to meet another cow. They're having a cow party. They might be meeting like a sheep and a hog there. It would take a while until they meet any giraffe in that story, even though that's the story I'm telling her. So don't be worried. I'm not telling her the whole truth so far. But I think us as the grown-ups, I think we should be aware that this is the time in the world we're living in right now. And we could see how we got there as well. Okay, just to wrap up, this is like a view of our of the living things in the biosphere, the wild ones. What about the thing that we humanity has been producing. Once we finished this census of life, we said we could look at the things that we made. We could also think about it as the anthropogenic mass made by used by humanity. So this would be our cell phones and cars, but also things we build out of concrete. That is rapidly increasing, and at the same time, the weight of the things that we've been living things, they're kind of like stable or going down. And in mathematics, there's some theorem that says if something is rapidly going up and something going down, at some point they're supposed to meet. And so we asked ourselves, if that's the situation, when would we reach this situation on Earth that the weight of things made by humanity would equal the mass of living things? And we've been spending some time working on that, and this is what we found out. So what you see here in green is the weight of all living things combined. In the different colors, you can see the components of the world that we're helping shape. And you can see that the year 2020, we arrived at the historic point where the weight of things made by humans now surpasses the weight of all living things combined. Meaning that if you have an alien arriving at Earth and sensing what is happening here, they would now measure more of this than of that. And we're now beyond this point. If you want to see it in a concrete visualization, the weight of buildings and infrastructure has now surpassed that of trees and shrubs. And the weight of plastic is now about twice the weight of all the animals combined. And I would like to finish with the question is, why is this important? And I think this, since we published it, this has been used for quite a few studies. So I think it does give a perspective, holistic one, that helps scientists talk about, the material composition of the biosphere, the flow of energy in the biosphere, the elemental composition, and all that, as well as things about ecology and taxonomy, etc. But I think there's a bigger story lying behind here, which I think is very relevant within the context of everything that's been happening here in Stockholm for several decades, and I think we might be adding something to the puzzle with that perspective. And that is the fact that when you think about the relationship between humanity and nature, there's a very deep concepts that humanity has been going with, and this could be exemplified. Where is this picture taking place? Exactly, Niagara Falls. And you might have had that experience. It doesn't have to be there, where you stood next to this strong waterfall and say, "Who am I versus this?" How powerful the forces of nature are. And us humans, we're just I'm just like a blip, like a tiny thing in comparison to all that. And that is obviously true, but what we don't have good intuition for is not what am I versus the Niagara Falls, or what am myself together with 8 billion like me, together with all of our machines. How does that compare to the forces of nature or the force of the Niagara Falls? And for that, I think we don't have a good intuition, because we didn't evolve to be able to deal with billions as number. And because we don't have a good intuition, that's where science comes into play. And doing this sort of statistical analysis, etc., is a way for us to find a scientific way to understand what otherwise is not intuitively understandable. And I think when we do that, and I gave you one example, we find that this understanding of thinking of it as nature as such an immense force that is way beyond anything that humanity could achieve, does not hold water anymore in 2024. We are now at a world where our force in many respects is on par with that. And you can see that, for example, by the weight, but I could give you many other examples. I just don't have time now. And I think in that respect, some of the perceptions that we have need to go through a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift, that wouldn't be the first time that we have paradigm shift as a result of the interaction or how we perceive nature and humanity. We could go through a short history of time. We had 10,000 years before, so let me go through a shorter one. What about the perception? Initially we thought we're like the center of the universe, right? And that was the relationship between us, humanity, in the center, and the rest of the universe. The Copernican revolution showed us that actually we're not the center of the universe. We're revolving around the sun, and later that revolves in the galaxy, and there's many, many other galaxies. So this is one main paradigm shift. Fast forward a few hundred years, comes the Darwinian revolution that tells us that we're not just the central species that dominates everything. We're just one species out of millions of species that evolved in a similar manner. And that's also a huge shift for human thinking and societies, etc., with all sorts of repercussions. And I would say in the Anthropocene, we're actually in a third paradigm shift, that there's evidence for many places that actually, even though what we learned from Darwin is correct about how we evolved, but this concept of us just being equal or so similar to all the other species, we should update that because we've now became again a dominant player in shaping the destiny of both the biosphere as well as the other species. And in that respect, it's also somewhat challenging as another revolution because it kind of goes in some way in the different direction than what we said. So far we were just demoting humanity to be just, nothing special. But actually we have a story now to tell where we actually are special. And with that, I think special status comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of things we should care for and take into account. So with that, I think I would finish given the time. I would just mention the urgency that we have about accelerating positive social tipping points that could be the transitions into what we really need in Anthropocene in terms of sustainability. This is made for sharing, so please, feel free to share the presentation in any way you see right. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ron. This is such an amazing way to look at ourselves in relation to the rest of this planet. Really fascinating work. Now, please welcome Eva from Tel Aviv University, and we'll tell you about some of this evolutionary heredity at different scales.
So I want to talk about all kinds of networks in the Anthropocene. And I will start with something that probably many of you know. And this is what Kate Rathwood described as donut economics. And she was describing the human kind of social system as well as the kind of ecological system and trying to look at the safe and just space for humanity within the interaction between these two systems. And I'm quoting her. She said, the environmental ceiling consists of 9 planetary boundaries as set out by Rockstrom et al., beyond which lie unacceptable environmental degradation and potential tipping points in Earth systems. The 12th dimension of the social foundations are derived from internationally agreed minimum social standards as identified by the world's government. So, between social and planetary boundaries lies an environmentally safe and socially just space in which humanity can thrive. Now, we are going beyond this space, obviously. And when she was thinking about the basic human needs, she was thinking about water, food, health, education, income, political voice, social equity, gender equity, and things like that. And when she was thinking about the environment, she was thinking about pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, all kinds of freshwater withdrawals, and so on and so forth. And the relationship, and we are already overshooting the safe and just environment in which we live. Now I want to say something about pollution. Pollution is a systemic problem. It's not one problem. There are, first of all, many types of pollution. This is plastic pollution. Ron has been talking about plastic, which is weighs much more than all the animals in the world, right? And one of the components of plastic is bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disruptor, and which is causing a lot of problems to animals and to including humans, and has multiple long-term cascading effects on health of living organisms, on biodiversity, on water and food availability, and on many other social dimensions. This is pollution. The other thing that has systemic effects are the wars of the Anthropocene. There were wars before the Anthropocene. There were wars throughout human history. But the wars in the 20th century have been global and encompassed a lot of people, a lot of places. And within the context of the environmental and ecological degradation, they have an enormous impact. And they contribute to the problems of the Anthropocene. All 12 dimensions of the social foundations of human well-being are wrecked by war. And again, wars have long-term psychological, physiological, epigenetic, social, ecological effect. And all this are much more long-term and much more serious than we usually think. So I wanted to, for obvious reasons, I am very worried about armed conflicts, and I'm trying to understand what exactly it means and what the consequences of this are. So, like pollution, armed conflicts are systemic problems and systemic catastrophes. And not only do they lead to pollution, it was estimated, for example, that the armed conflict in the Ukraine 1 year had the carbon footprint of this 1 year is as great as the carbon footprint of Belgium throughout a whole year. And now this calculation can be challenged because it's a very conventional and very minimalistic kind of calculation. Probably the numbers are much greater. So, and the point that I want to emphasize now, because I'm a biologist by training, is that armed conflict and pollution, both of them, lead to physiological and psychological problems that can span generations. It's not just we who suffer. It's our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that can suffer. And this conflict can lead through all kinds of feedbacks to chronic self-sustaining effects. So what I want to talk about is to talk about what I'm calling misery cycles. Then I want to zoom on the role of epigenetic aspects of these cycles, the physiological aspects, long-term aspects of these cycles. And then I will end with a note of hope, that once we understand what's going on, once we understand the dynamics of these systems, we can intervene. It is up to us to intervene. We need good political and social will to intervene, but we need to understand the system of interactions that leads to this misery cycles. So I'm quoting here Romain Rolland. It's usually attributed to Gramsci. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect, I mean, we are in a dire state of affairs. The situation is not good. But there is a possibility of change, and it's up to us. Right, so let's look at one cycle, one of many cycles of misery. And this is urban poverty in the United States. It's a self-sustaining cycle of deprivation. It is known that it is simply ongoing, and that, for example, in the United States, children born in the lower quintile, the lower 20% of the socioeconomic ladder, have only 1% chance to end up in the highest. And the lower you go, the more difficult it is to move away from this cycle of poverty. And why is it so difficult? People are trying to change the situation. It's not good for anybody. Nevertheless, it goes on and on and on. We can think about other cycles, like abuse, cycles of abuse that are happening in families, going on from one generation to the next, and many, many, many other cycles. What is going on? How can we think about it? Why is it so persistent and robust? So what this figure is showing us is that if we want to understand the system of interactions that for example, poverty, the poverty trap in which people, unfortunately, are, some people find themselves, we have to look at a particular level. For example, we look at a neighborhood, at a poor neighborhood in New York or somewhere, and we're looking at the interactions at this level, at the individual level, and at the psychosocial level, at the family, at what is going on in this neighborhood. But we also have to look at other factors. And for example, we have to look at the network of epigenetic factors that are the epigenetic effects that are the result of eating junk food, of drugs that are circulating and taken, and alcohol included, lead in water, violence that people are undergoing, and understand how these are changing the physiology of the individuals within this society. And these things interact with each other. It's not just one factor, it's several factors that are working together. In the same way that at the level of the neighborhood, where we are looking in the middle, the attractor that is formed is made up of all kinds of interactions at this level too. But there is another level we have to look at. We have to look at one thing that is happening there is that there is the global, we have to look at the education system within the city. We have to look at the political system. We have to look at the geographical segregation of poor areas from rich areas. We have to look at the financial level. And this too is a network. So there are three networks here. And the network, the focal network in the middle, where we see the trap, the attractor, what is underlying it, in this case, all this kind of epigenetic effects of all kinds of bad food, bad drinks, bad many things, and the more global effects. And together they're interacting, and these three networks are creating this trap. And it is robust because there are all kinds of positive feedback interactions between these factors. And that's why and this is the problem. This is why it is so robust, and what it makes clear to us once we identify the factors, once we identify the relations, we can identify these points within the three systems or subsystems that are all interacting. Yes, we can only heuristically separate them, and it's important to do it. But then we can point out to those points within the networks which are particularly important for the positive feedbacks, the self-sustaining feedbacks, and intervene there. And there will be almost always, more than one intervention point. Now, when we're thinking about, one of the factors that I have been thinking about quite a lot was this physiological factor. The fact that things like trauma, things like pollution, have transgenerational effects. They affect not just the individual. They affect its offspring, it affects its grand offspring. And what we're seeing here is a picture that my friend has drawn. It's called Five Mothers. I apologize to the males. There are fathers too, and they're very, very important, but that's what she drew. And these are kind of routes of transmission of information. So we have transmission, we have genetic transmission through genetic variations make a difference to the phenotype, to what we are. There are variations in all kinds of factors that are found at the biochemical level, but above the DNA, sort of the epigenetic factors on the chromatin, on the chromosomes, as well as in the rest of the cell. They are the factors that are affecting the development of the embryo in utero. There's early development, which is very, very important. All kinds of factors that are transmitted through food, through milk, and so on. And the great mother culture in which we are all embedded. Now, the point about it is that it's not only forming us as individuals, it's not only the inputs into our development, it's also inputs into the heredity of our children and grandchildren. And this is what is important for me here, because the fact that all these factors are important for our development is trivial. We know this. What was surprising for people was, for example, the fact that the epigenetic aspects are not only developmental, they can be hereditary, that there is memory across generations here. So, and this was called epigenetics. And epigenetics is defined today as the study of developmental processes that lead to persistent and self-maintaining changes in the states of organisms, in the components of organisms, or sometimes in the lineages of organisms. And there are mechanisms which we can today identify at the molecular level, epigenetic mechanisms, and they lead to what we call cell memory or cell heredity. And there are different ways in which we have to think about transmission of information. the transmission of epigenetic information, of developmental information, can be mediated through the environment, through niche construction. It can go from soma to soma, like from the mother to the child, for example, in utero, through in utero kind of communication. And it can also lead to changes in the sex cells themselves, in the chromatin of the sex cells, not in the DNA sequence itself, but in things that are superimposed on the DNA. And I want to focus on this. Now, so let's go back to the pollution in the Anthropocene, to the horrible bisphenol A effects. Now, we know quite a lot about the effects on humans, but we know far more details about the effects on mice and other rodents. So let's see what it is. So here it is. There is a female who is pregnant, and she's exposed to bisphenol A at a particular period of her development, and she's exposed to bisphenol A at levels which are comparable to the levels to which humans are exposed to this kind of stuff, and everybody is exposed to it, by the way. Now, this has heritable effects, many different heritable effects. One of them, increased obesity, is transmitted for 6 generations. There is one input into development of this mother. All her offspring. So what the kind of experiment that is done here is as following. You give this stuff to the pregnant female. She gives birth to offspring, males and females. You take the males, you mate them with normal females that have never been exposed, and the males themselves, of course, are not exposed during development. Then you take the offspring of this generation. Again, you take the males, mate them with normal females, and this you do for 6 generations. So the exposure to bisphenol A has happened once. The effect goes depending on the trait for 2 generations, 3 generations, 6 generations. So this is one example. This is an example of pollution. We are not mice, and I'm not trying to tell you that we react in the same way as mice, but we're not that different, and this is a kind of alarm bell that we should listen to. Now let's look at war, at the effects of trauma, of war. There are lots of things involved in war. Not just psychological trauma, very often, unfortunately, other aspects too, but just psychological trauma is bad enough. So here's an experiment which again looks at the effects of trauma in mice. This is something that is called MSUS, and it looks at the heritable effects of maternal separation, which is an unpredictable stress. So what you do is there is a female mouse, and she gives birth to some offspring. And what you do is, during the first 14 days, you separate her from the offspring for 3 hours a day at unpredictable times. This does not mean that the offspring are hungry or thirsty or anything like that, but they're enormously stressed, and so is she, because to be away from the mother for 3 hours at this point of time is terrible for them. And during that time, when they're separated from her, she is also undergoing unpredictable stress. She's put in some kind of, either they put her in water, so she has to swim, which she hates, or she's confined. Something nasty happens to her, and then after 3 hours, she's brought back to the offspring, and she cares for them as well as she can, but of course, she's traumatized. So she can't care to them very, very well. She does her best, poor thing, but that's what happens. And again, you do the same kind of thing. You take the males, the offspring, who are of course stressed and neurotic in all kinds of ways, in mouse kind of ways, and then you mate them with normal females, look at their offspring males, and do that for several generations, and you find out that there are all kinds of effects of this stress that are transmitted, in this case also, up to the 6th generation, depending on the effects. Some effects are only transmitted for 3, some for 2. It doesn't behave like genetic transmission. It behaves differently. It's much more complicated. We'll not go into the mechanisms, although we do understand something about the mechanisms. So again, what we see here is that there are transgenerational effects of stress. Now, we do know that this is not specific to mice. Humans, too, are under stress has transgenerational effects in humans. Children of veteran soldiers, the males, have 5 times more probability of developing PTSD than a control group. Girls, 3 times more. When you are looking at the sperm of the veterans, the sperm that is what they transmit to the next generation, you see changes in epigenetic factors, in genes that are relevant to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, these are correlative kind of experiments. There are all kinds of epidemiological studies. We don't understand the full picture. And the story is more complicated than I'm telling you at the moment, of course. But it's a story that, again, should raise big alarm bells in us. And we must understand that what we are doing when we are doing this conflict, and the politicians should be aware of it, which I don't believe that it will move them at all, but who knows? But maybe if we make enough noise, something will happen. That these are long-term effects. We are really damaging the next generations here. Okay, and we understand not only what the effects are, both in the case of pollution and in the case of trauma in this particular experiment, we also know something about the biochemical epigenetic mechanisms that are involved. I will not go into these details because this is not very relevant to us here, and I hope that you believe me that there are such studies. Now we come to the optimistic bit. Okay, so far it was the pessimism of the intellect, unfortunately. But it is one of the great things that was discovered was that if you're taking these experiments with the mice, and you're taking the stressed males, the poor things that whose mother was sort of separated from them, and they developed all kinds of problems as a result, yes? And you put them into an environment which is different from the normal environment in which these mice are kept in the lab. You put them into what is called enriched environment, EE, which means that they have places to play and to hide and to exercise and to have friends and, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. And what you actually reverse the epigenetic effects. And the offspring of this male mice are normal. There's no inheritance of epigenetic effect. They are completely reversed in sperm too, in the sperm of these males. So these are very good news. Probably this would not happen with pollution, but it does happen with this type of thing. And this gives us hope that we can intervene if we have the will to intervene. Now, this is not something that requires great intellectual power to understand that good conditions, we didn't need epigenetics to tell us that if we give animals good conditions, wonderful good things will happen. We do understand that. But what we didn't understand is how deeply under the skin it goes. And it does. And we can change things if we want to. So, what I want to say here, and what is the thing that gives me at least some kind of hope, is that there is a possibility of doing something about the situation. First of all, we have to understand, depending on the system which we are studying, the kind of feedback loops that are making this system, that are creating the misery cycles that we are seeing all over the place, at many different levels. The other thing that, and once we understand what they are, and once we understand a little bit more the biology of it too, because there is something that I think we should call the biology of culture, the biological effects of cultural constructions. If we understand that, if we understand this, the deep physiological effects of social life, we can intervene and should intervene, and we can make a difference to these cycles of misery. Thank you.
Really
beautiful work and inspiring, both in the depth of the trauma and the way that it can be reversed. Now over to Esteban Yubaji and a tour of the history of South America.
That's just was in case of questions.
Okay. Thanks, Eva. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Henrik. And thanks, Maria and Irene. You probably listen, Irene. Few questions there. It's my daughter. So, what you are going to see now is what happens when you ask an agronomist to tell the history of a continent. So, this is going to be a very special perspective based on agriculture, an attempt to look at the Anthropocene from the perspective of a single continent. I think we need better visions for the future, but often I think that by trying to have a single one that's global, we miss a lot of the tension between continents, between countries, between societies, that we need to address if we want to get out at the end of the pipe with better solutions. So the reason I want to bring agriculture is, first of all, because in this workshop we were talking about ourselves and the earth, how we affect the earth, how the earth affects us, and the fact that in a deeper way we are part of the earth, and that's it. And agriculture is a very interesting example about the intimacy of this relationship. We do many more brutal things than agriculture, but no one is so intimate in the way we interact with the rest of the biosphere. We change the species, we change the seasonality, we change the shape of landscapes, and that changes ourselves too. And these are two examples. That's Rwanda. Prisoners in Rwanda that are preparing more land for agriculture. The other one is an advertisement of combined machines from the US. And they show the same thing, and it's the fact that agriculture is still expanding. In these two places, we are trying to push agriculture to higher slopes in order to have more land. So if one aspect is intimacy, the other one is the fact that I want to bring now, is the fact that for a very long time, this human biomass that Ron was showing was strongly coupled to the presence of farms, of agriculture. People was where the crops were, and the crops were where people was. No, don't ask what's the chicken and what's the egg there, but the fact that these two aspects were strongly coupled until recently. We can still see that coupling in the maps of Africa. Although there's some decoupling in cities, Africa still has the strongest correlation between crop density and human population. But this correlation is being broken really fast as we move to cities and as we move food from one continent to the other. And the South American continent spearheaded this decoupling. And that's why I want to start with the only continent that I know so well, which is the one where I live and where I work. And I will start with the first stop of 5 stops in history. And the first one is contact. Europeans contacting the local people. And after COVID, I think we can emotionally understand this contact much better. People coming in those ships were bringing disease that were not known in the Americas. And we now know, much better than 20 years ago, that this contact caused the mortality of 90% of the population in South America, in Latin America. In this case, I'm talking about the whole Latin America. So we think we had 60 million people in the continent, and it went down to 6 million after only 50 to 100 years. Historical data shows that, but very interestingly, there's a conversion with what more recently molecular data shows. Mitochondrial DNA helps us understand how many mothers there were in the past. And there was a bottleneck, a very strong bottleneck, when people crossed the Bering Strait to get into the Americas. But there's another bottleneck coming later on, which is this episode of mortality. As a result, this coupling that I was showing in Africa was broken right away. And we are still learning how much agriculture there was there today. Archaeology has shown amazing things. Upano Valley in Ecuador, up there on the right, was discovered a long time ago, but now we understand this was a very large village, now under the forest. We actually know that places that, when I was studying agronomy, my professors told me that were impossible for farming, were actually cultivated. The terras pretas in Amazonia were farms. And we now know that these farms were built through generations and sustain a lot of people living in the Amazon forest, a place that we think wouldn't be good for agriculture today. The last one is irrigation in the dry Andes, where we realized that there was a lot more people and a lot more farms than today. So this continent lost agriculture and gained a new agriculture. And this is the second stop. One more thing I want to say. Some people think that the abandonment of agricultural land in this period could have been responsible for the sequestration of carbon in an enough amount to trigger the Little Ice Age. There's discussion about that, but the proportions of the stocks involved make sense to play with that hypothesis. Well, there was not only metals in the Americas. Once the metals were already in their way to their zinc countries, there was the opportunity to get some agricultural products. You need an agricultural product that's very expensive per unit of weight in order to make it interesting to put it in a ship and send it to the other part of the world. And one of those was sugar, probably the more emblematic one. Sugar was a treat for the elites at the beginning. Its consumption was very low, but it kept growing with time. And it became actually an important source of calories for the workers in the industrial world in Europe. How do you make sugar? Well, you lost a lot of your workers. You bring more people to the continent. And that was one of the most massive migrations in history. Slaves from Africa going to the Americas. But you had to feed your slaves. And you need not only calories, but proteins. And the place where I worked, the Pampas, were the source of those proteins. Cattle, almost wild cattle being hunted in the Pampas, dried and salted, and sent through this triangle of commerce all the way to feed the slaves. So you can see this extractive machinery that works with land, people, and capital and money in its way forward in the continent. Next stop. What you see here is the largest investment of the British Crown outside the British Empire. The railroads in the Pampas. And they were this amazing funnel that allow you to move now something that's not so expensive, grain. But you also need people to grow grain. Once you had everything working well, that people was one of the most massive, I think I lost a piece here. Yeah, but don't worry. Yeah, here it is. 13 million European immigrants going to Latin America, and many of them dedicated to grow cereals that were, after 1850, starting to flow to Europe in greater amount than what was coming from Europe to the Americas, to Latin America. So, next stop. We are not alone as humans, and Ron has shown us that we are accompanied by a huge amount of livestock. And grain feeds us as other items, but grain is feeding these companion animals that we eat. And the map on the top shows you what proportion of the agriculture is used for food, which is the green, and what proportion of the agriculture is used to for feed and fuel. Fuel wouldn't be that important in that equation in most places. It's mostly feed. So you can see that the Americas in general, and particularly South America, is growing grain to feed these animal companions. That's work by Cassidy some years ago. So basically, this part of the world is becoming the big farm that ships two key grains, mostly soybean and maize, all the way to where we raise these animals that we eat. Of course, along this flow, there's flow of nutrients, for example, that end polluting waters in the other corner of the world with the material that these grains got from this continent. And this, just to remind me and you, this flow chain has also inputs for the agriculture, like herbicides, that are changing completely the intimacy with which we transform nature in order to grow crops. It looks like a very sad story, isn't it? And for me, after listening Eva, I would say we should be in an impossible misery cycle in this continent, but we are not. So there must be healing cycles or prosperity cycles embedded there. Which are those? I'm an agronomist, I have no idea, but I'm sure there are. Well, after the last World Cup, in the city of Buenos Aires, we had 5 million people celebrating with not a single accident, not a single problem. So that tells something. The capacity to share and to be part of a larger community with self-organization. I don't know what it is. I would like that to be the solution. And I would like to know that soccer players will inherit through epigenetics the capacities of the ones that we have today. But this change in ecosystems, not so much in society, let's go back to the ecosystems now, has created amazing experiments. Some of them are really worrying about what can happen with the functioning of nature. And this is part of my own investigation on the water cycle. While agriculture almost everywhere is blamed for using too much water, what we see in this part of the world is that agriculture actually uses less water than the previous ecosystems that we have there. For one reason, mainly, and it's that these exporting systems are usually profitable if you lower down the cost a lot. And to lower down the cost, you don't irrigate, for example. And what we are seeing is that the plains are getting flooded a lot more than before. The maps here show the density of agriculture in the continent. And this map shows you, with the size of the bubbles, how much floods you get. But with the color, they show you how much of that flood happened after the year 2000. So in the color, you see how much of the flooding is a relatively new thing. We do this with remote sensing. And what we found is that the most intensely cultivated areas are getting more and more flooded. And that means, for example, that our soccer fields get flooded. You can see the crops in the back. Interestingly, the agriculture doesn't suffer this that much as other sectors. For example, towns suffer it a lot. The little dairy production that we still have suffers a lot more than the agriculture, which is the main, let's say, culprit of this change. Basically, because one of the things with this intimacy of changes that we do with agriculture that we did was to change plants and then make them more like monsters producing a lot of seed and having less of other parts, like roots. The roots of crops, of annual crops, are very shallow compared to the roots of forests and grasslands. For those who were with me in the workshop, you knew I was going to talk or say something about phosphorus. Phosphorus is an amazing element to look at the biosphere, and is strongly pushed by agriculture. The grains that we harvest and we move to another continent have a lot of phosphorus in them, And in order to produce them, we need to have phosphorus in the soil. And something interesting is happening now in the continent. One part of the continent has these red soils that are extremely poor in phosphorus. There's no way you can do agriculture here if you don't add a lot of phosphorus. When I was a student, they told me that it was impossible to farm these soils. Today, they are being farmed because we over-fertilize them. On the other hand, you have these very rich soils with which Argentina was blessed that have enormous stocks of phosphorus. As a result, Brazil is today the #1 importer of phosphorus from mainly Morocco, the main exporting country, whereas Argentina is the main exporter of its own native soil phosphorus outside the continent. No other fluxes of phosphorus are so large in the biosphere today. Well, let's go to numbers. Demographically, South America is quite unique. This figure shows the global share that this is Latin America. Again, I'm switching from South America to Latin America depending on the data I had available. This is whole Latin America, and its share of total human population, its share of agricultural land, and its share of the GDP through this period from 1400 to the present. 1, the big decline of population. 2, the sugarcane period. Look, agricultural land never went so low as population. 3, the big boom of immigration from Europe and the expansion of agriculture in the first wave. In this period, GDP is following agricultural land with some delay and reaching it. We were relatively rich compared to the rest of the world in this period that ended in the 80s. After that, agricultural land kept going up with this new model of soybean maize being exported to feed animals, whereas the share in GDP went down. Where are we heading? I don't know, but one way to think about the future, excuse me for this very binary proposal, but it's the first step, is that we not only need to ask about sustainability, but about sovereignty. A country that has been affected, or a continent that has been affected so much by decisions and forces outside, has been struggling a lot about sovereignty. And sustainability comes nowadays to add another question mark for the future. And we know that a lot of the global discussions are about being sustainable or not, but mostly on the side of non-sovereignty. So we could do, in a non-sustainable scenario, just the global food mine for the future. Or we may be this world virtuous backyard. But what virtues are important there? Would be carbon sequestration, the biodiversity for the world, or the well-being of people, the quality of water, the livelihoods of those who are there. We have some experiments of strong pressure on sovereignty, but some of those examples end in extractive poverty traps. This space, which as a South American is the one I want to be living in, still requires names. I will stop here. The last thing I want to say is that the agricultural component of our Earth system presents a paradox. Never before agriculture was occupying so much land and influencing the biosphere so much. Never before agriculture was such a tiny amount of our economy and a tiny amount of our culture. How are we going to reconcile these two things? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esteban. So we had scheduled a short thinking, reflection, and asking questions session here. There were There's so much exciting information in these talks. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts and the questions that you may have. I would suggest that you first spend just half a minute, try to digest all the information that you have. Then we'll spend like just a few minutes of questions before moving into a bit of a panel with some reflection from some of our other participants during the workshop. So I would just invite you to just digest what you've heard for a few moments. And after that, we can take a few urgent questions to the speakers. And again, you're more than welcome to contact us if you want answers to your questions also at a later stage. So just please take a half a minute. All right, so we'll take a few minutes for questions to our speakers, and possibly we'll be able to have a few minutes at the end as well, see how the panel conversation goes. But does anyone want to start with any questions to the speakers? And if you do have one, please, it'd be nice to hear your name and your affiliation too. Yes, please, Pella.
Yes, Pella Thiel, Rights of Nature, Sweden, and I'm so curious about, you mentioned positive tipping points, and your hope in the end was about epigenetics for healing, and then there was that corner of sustainable and sovereign. So I'm just so curious, like what movements or ideas or processes do you see, like any of you, that are your favorite positive tipping points?
I just want to say that I don't think that epigenetic engineering is going to solve the problem. I mean, there is such a thing, by the way, but that's a technology that is developing. But I think that what the experiment on mice showed is that you change the social environment, and the social environment changes your sociology, your physiology, in a way that goes really deep into the system and can change the epigenetic marks. So I think that the first thing that we have to learn is to change the social system, to go top down and not bottom up. In fact, in the way that when we think about the system. But the epigenetic aspects are important. They are important correlates of what is happening. We have to understand. They are part of how the system is constructed. We have to understand them. We have to measure, to be able also to measure them. And to, but when I'm thinking about interventions, I'm thinking about not about the physiological levels directly, but indirectly. So although sometimes if things are very bad, yes, and there's no other way, yes, you will have to intervene also directly at the physiological level. And possibly this would be sometimes the case with chemical pollution or with all kinds of toxins. So it depends very much on the case, but the first thing that we have to do is social changes. And I don't know what the positive tipping points are. I mean, we are a very robust species and very, very incredibly creative, incredibly cooperative. So somehow these things have to be mobilized.
Thanks. Do you want to add to that?
Yes, I can add it, like in terms of the positive social tipping points that need to happen. So there is a significant effort to try and map those. So for example, there's this Systems Change Lab, which is an effort to create a dashboard for humanity. And they characterize something like 50 different positive social tipping points that need to happen.
And which is your favorite?
Yeah, so I'll get to that in just 1 second. So the good news is that like there is now a serious effort to try and map that and also to follow that of where we're standing. The sad news is that like in most cases, we're not anywhere near as rapidly as it needs to change, but at least we know. Right? My favorite thing, I think the closest thing to like if you like a silver bullet to many of the things, relates to changes in our dietary choices and in general, how we get our food, because that's the main impact, as also was mentioned here, about our land resources, water resources, effects on ecological systems, pollution, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the direction I think, like, if you need to choose one, although I think we should not choose one. We should do this, this, and that. But if you're asking me what's my favorite one, that's the direction. And if you like, and how together, that's a longer discussion. So.
Thanks. Really nice question. Yes, Bruno?
Bruno Studin, Stockholm Resilience Center. My question relates to all the presentations, but I will start with the agriculture and move backwards. If we see the curves and also the history from medieval times and onwards, as you showed, and the curves, then you could ask yourself, what are the normative maps that would drive the different curves? And especially, of course, you would glance at our time, but the normative maps that did drive them in earlier centuries would also be there. There might be other ones. It might be the British Empire wanting to expand, the distribution of wealth in the society and whatever. So I'm thinking about it like a map for the Stockholm marine situation, or where how the bottom looks like. So when you go out with your boat, you are not cracking some of the stones under. So I'm asking about the normative map of the similarity to the marine, and that goes then to the agriculture, and it goes also to the other speakers, because you could go for the way how the disorders, the mental disorders, it's also hidden map needed of the normative nature, and also the ideas about the social aspects of flipping points, because the flipping point is then taking that map and seeing how it would be better orientation in moving with your ship, sort of humankind. So, what about the normal maps, the normative maps?
Yeah, if I think about agriculture in Latin America, mainly the region I was showing, I think we go back to the past, and geopolitical tension in big powers in the world were the biggest windows of opportunity for change in the periphery. Look at the independence wars. That was one of the periods in which some of the most interesting changes in the system were made. There was a decline in sugarcane production. There was an increase in local food production. And there was also an appreciation of the pre-colonial legacy in many of the independence movements. Next one is something that Matilda was around. She explained me a lot about that part of history in Latin America, the developmentalist or desarrollista movement, which came during the Cold War, when there was tension between Russia or the Soviet Union and the West. We went through this unipolar world now, and tension is rising up again. So from the perspective of peripheral agricultural countries, I think this can be seen as an opportunity for two things: negotiate sovereignty and negotiate the value of agricultural products. So my map, my first map, would be a map of geopolitical power.
Thank you so much. Really nice. We'll see if we can come back with some time to questions. But with that, I think we're going to move into our panel. And as I'm asking our panelists to come down here to the stage, I would ask all of you, if you want to just stand up for a few seconds and just get some oxygen into your system before we move on to this next phase. Right, if you can find your seats again, please. So we have another 20 minutes of talking like this in plenary, and I'm sure many of us will stay around if you have questions. Of course, we've heard a very diverse perspectives of the intertwined biosphere, really a whirlwind tour from a spruce tree to a continent and everything in between, or a few things in between. But at this panel, I would like to introduce Carl Folke from the Stockholm Resilience Center, from the Bayer Institute here at the Academy, and from the Anthropocene Laboratory, Belinda Reyes from the University of Pretoria, and Ariane Koenig from the University of Luxembourg. And you have all worked a lot with the perspective of the intertwined biosphere, and you've also worked a lot in trying to change scientific institutions, policy and practice, and corporations. So it'd be really nice to hear a little bit about your perspectives on how these perspectives of coming into the world, how it's starting to become more and more incorporated, but also some of the challenges in incorporating that. But first of all, it'd be nice to, if you just introduce yourself in addition to your affiliation, so that the audience here will get a bit more of a background of who you are and where you're coming from. So you want to start?
So I'm active at the University of Luxembourg and with international peers to build the field of transformative sustainability science, which is a science that's embedded in practice and actively seeks to catalyze change. And we also built a study program for that to equip change agents in Luxembourg. So we say practice on top, science on tap.
That was nice.
Oh, I wish I had a good line like that. So I'm Belinda Reyes. I'm a South African researcher who mostly works between government and practitioners in policy and research, and I have been fortunate to live in Stockholm and work for the Stockholm Resilience Center, and now move between South Africa and Stockholm. And I think we have similar research interests in this area of sustainability science, and mine is particularly on the social ecological systems theories and methods, and how those can be made practical and useful in various policy and practice contexts. But I'm going to be talking a bit more about that just now.
And I'm Carl Folke, and I'm from here, from this place. Actually, the Bayer Institute is just above us, and the Stockholm Resilience Center is on the other side of the road, and Anthropocene Lab close there too. So I like to be around here, and I like to live in Stockholm, and I'm really happy about that. And I've been doing this for a while. Probably since the early 80s, and I'm hopeful and not stressed. And I think we are in a new shift, moving away from the industrial era into something that we are working hard to find the good trajectories for the future.
Nice, thank you so much. So can you tell me then, Ariane, about the intertwined biosphere perspective? Do you feel that's being incorporated in the academic cycles that you're operating in, and how is that changing over time?
Definitely. So we have seen, sustainability science is a fairly fresh field, so some first articles around the turn of the millennium. And initially, I think the concern with human-environment interactions was there from the start, which makes it, of course, a challenge in science to be so interdisciplinary and to get an intertwined perspective. And I think the planetary boundaries model has increased the urgency. And then I think, over the last 2 decades, a concern with actors and agency has increased, so that we don't only think about higher levels of social organization and systems, but we don't only zoom out, but we also zoom in on the actors and meaning making. And I think now, more recently, there has been the so-called ontological turn. So if we think in terms of a famous systems thinker, Donella Meadows, she said, highest leverage points in pushing for change is transcending prevailing paradigms and so at the ontological level, our conceptual lenses that direct, that make us understand what matters. And so I think now there's more attention in the research on this aspect. How can we get to an ontological shift? And that is also a very central theme now in the Biosphere Project. So yes, so it's exciting times, and of course the shift shouldn't only be in theory, but we will be thinking about this connection to practice, and all of us. How can we engage in such a shift to see us as embedded in the biosphere?
Yeah, thanks much. I really like that, and also thinking about actors and agency. When I took a course in conservation biology a long time ago now, the teacher of the class said everyone in here is a unit of change, and I think that's a very powerful statement. And Ron was saying the other day that 8 billion people on the planet, there's a lot of units of change. So how do you want to channel that energy, I think, is an interesting question. And how do you want to move towards sort of collective action, towards addressing these collective challenges? So science, I think, is really stepping up to that challenge.
Yes.
Much to do still, but yeah.
Much to do.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the challenges later, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Lena, how about
policy and practice?
Yeah.
Right, how long do I have?
Yeah.
No. So, I mean, I think it's important to note that I work in like sort of global intergovernmental processes, sometimes UN processes, and then also quite on the ground with local NGOs and local communities. So it's going to be horribly generalized what I say here. But I think in this kind of idea of how are we advancing on the intertwined perspective, Eric, I don't think he's here anymore, he made this really great point in his talk a couple of days ago that we really need to be embracing this kind of suboptimal, messy, ambiguous space where we're not sort of striving for solutions or striving for efficiency. And I think that most of us, like you say, we're very comfortable working in this messy space. And I think we actually enjoy some of this ambiguity. It's really rich research grounds. And over the last couple of days, I've been listening out for some of these ambiguities or tensions because I thought maybe they can help me answer this question. So we've heard that it's urgent and it takes time. It's complex and needs simple solutions. It's bottom up and top down. It's about context and it's about scale. It's about the individual and it's about the system. It's about people and nature. And now we've heard a little bit about hope and despair. And so I think that, you know, the reason why I focus on these tensions isn't because I want to divide us. You know, the world certainly doesn't need more polarization, but I think it is that generative, fertile middle ground where we stop seeing the world in black and white and start to see these shades of color. But I think when you're in a policy and practice concept, that messiness and ambiguity can be extra challenging, right? Because you've got your sectors, you've got mandates, you've got your funding models, you've got your KPIs, and then you've got this tension between what you know and what you do. And I think all of us have that as well. Like we know a bunch of stuff and we still go and eat a hamburger. And I think, you know, in working with many practitioners, you realize that they certainly get that these are complex, intertwined systems, but then they go back into their systems where there are certain skill sets and certain approaches and methods and tools. And we see a lot of innovation, and actually, you know, we're trying to pull from some of that innovation back into the research and the methods. And I think this is my call to many of us in this room and our communities, is that this is the research gap, right? To really help think about the skills and the tools and the methods and the systems that would make this messiness a little bit more tractable. I'm not saying we solve it or we try and resolve tensions, but what are these intertwined methods? What methods work in the grey zone? And I've had these interesting experiences like with the Human Development Report, where, you know, we all don't like GDP, and then we came up with this Human Development Index, and I think even Amartya Sen writes this lovely introduction to the 2020 report where he talks about the vulgarity of the HDI measure and how he was so not keen to have anything to do with that measure, and then how, you know, he was convinced because GDP is even more vulgar, you know. So I think that we're seeing a lot of these kinds of, I think my biggest tension at the moment is how do I work in ways that improve the status quo and also change the status quo? Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a real challenge for those of us who think about adaptation versus transformation and are we causing more lock-ins? But this is something I think it seems to me like a really cool research agenda out there that is very applicable in the Anthropocene, is these kinds of methods that both make something, you know, we've now got the Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index, which is also quite vulgar because it's just carbon and materials, but it's certainly capturing a bit more of this intertwinedness. So how do we progress along those kind of business as usual trajectories to replace something like GDP, while also thinking about what exists beyond the world that gets measured in one indicator. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is where there's a really fertile ground in this research to practice, research to policy space.
Nice.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bela. Really nice. How about you, Kalle?
Yeah, okay. So you asked me to talk a little bit about science and the experiences we had with businesses.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I would like just to give a sort of a snapshot of some work we've been doing. We were really interested in looking at places that actually seem to have shifted very, very much from sort of basically having no coordination of their resources or ecosystems to start a collective journey and start to do it in a much more sustainable way. And what's really positive there is that we found that only very few individuals, only 2 to 3 individuals can actually make huge change, actually. So we found that the few individuals, often confronted with some type of crisis, perceived or real, start to generate a new way of thinking about the world. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the will, really, and that could improve things, actually. And then after a while, they start to connect to the networks and start to talk about it and develop sort of a social context and a social capital around the whole thing. And then they connect with new networks that they have not connected with before. And in that process, a lot of innovation comes up. And a lot of new ways and tools and techniques emerges out of that interaction. And often we found that a new form of organizational structure emerges out of that. We call it bridging organization, that connects the local to the higher level of governance. And they're sort of preparing for change, actually. But often they can't do much because they are locked in by economic incentives or political situations. But suddenly there's a window opening up. And then they can take the whole effort that they have prepared and move it through that window and shift into completely new direction. So what I'm telling you now is basically 20, 30 different case studies where we looked into that and find similar patterns happening. And then Henrik and I, we were talking about that, if we could think about who are the really key players in the world who are shaping the planet. So we asked the question, could it be actors that not only shaping the global economy, but also shaping the way the planet works. So we started with the oceans and discovered 13 big multinational companies. And we started to call them keystone actors. And we were wondering whether we could start to interact with them to make them basically shift the way the whole sectors were working, basically create a cascade because of their power and their role in the global system. If they changed and changed direction, perhaps that could lead to pretty big change. Yeah. So we started like that. And I think the paper you and Jean-Baptiste worked for several years on that paper, and it came out 2015, was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then 2016 we started the first workshops with these companies, actually, and been going on since then. And after a while, they created something called CBOS, Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. And to me, there's a lot of things that are difficult and messy, really, and we all the time have to develop new ways of approaching things. But what's really cool is that there's a lot of trust in that process now, and they listen to the synthesis we're doing of the best available understanding right now for different aspects of the oceans and how the ocean and the global trade system and other things interact. But the coolest thing for me is that we have been able to really complement or change the purpose for why they're doing the businesses. Because when we started out, all of them were looking at themselves as producers of a certain commodity, basically seafood, and that was it. Basically 3 Japanese companies, 2 Thai, 1 South Korean, the big Cargill and fish meal producers and aquaculture producers, and they had never thought about it. For example, one of the companies didn't even know where the fish came from. They were selling the fish, although they were bigger in their turnover than many nations in the world actually. But now they really realize that we can't do it like this. We have to become stewards of the oceans if we are all going to be able to continue with seafood production. So that's that's a huge. Talking about paradigm shift, you mentioned that some broad paradigm shifts, but I think that's really a huge thing when these type of players start to sort of change the compass quite radically into another direction. And we're seeing a result of it right now. They're sort of helping them to clean up bad stuff basically now. And the next step is now really to become stewards of ocean ecosystems. We're moving into that space right now with them. So I think it's very exciting. You may want to complement that a bit. And Lisa, who sits up there, she also developed, I think, inspired by that, a whole course for CEOs that we have been running here in Stockholm. We have had over 90 CEOs, and basically all big Swedish companies at the CEO level has taken that a training basically, which is basically the intertwined biosphere, understanding that we're living on a planet and these type of things. And it is quite interesting to note that many of them, when they hear it, becomes obvious, but many of them didn't know what the biosphere was and things like that, and had no idea that they thought about this is the climate issue, and if we fix it with technology, then we're fine. These type of things. So I think we really broadened their perspective of what it means to be on a planet, and actually we can see the effects of that in the strategies of many companies in this country actually now after a couple of years. How many years have we done it, Lisa?
6 years.
6 years now. So I think that's why I'm saying I'm hopeful, because you can 4, 5, 6 years is not a long time. Yeah. And I've been on to this since 30 years, which is also an extremely short time actually. But when I started out, it was really polarized. There was conservation of the natural world versus development, and now I think many people realize that if the planet is not working in a good way, we won't be able to have civilizations on it. Actually, that's a recognition that goes really fast in many facets of the world.
It's really nice the way you talk about these things, because it sounds to me like no longer can you say it's not a problem, and no longer can you say, well, we can fix it. But you really have to, like, the way I interpret you is like you stay with the trouble. The way like Donna Haraway wrote beautifully about staying with the trouble. And I think this is really a different approach. Yeah. And that's, I think, is fascinating, and it cuts across the way I interpret you at least. So that's really nice.
And that's a great keyword to lead to the challenges. Mm-hmm. So now we heard from Kalle sort of what it can look like in an ideal case, and I'm taking my cue from Belinda and organize the challenges around tensions. And I think in some areas, in some spots, sustainability science has opened doors, but in many places in the world, it's very hard to find funding and to get more legitimacy for this new research mode. And tensions include that suddenly scientists are no longer neutral, objective observers, but they're participants. Another challenge is that this science seeks to co-create with actors in the field normative recommendations on questions, issues where there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's another challenge. And thirdly, then we try to do this leveraging knowledge fields across different disciplines where you have often structural contradictions, because different research fields look at different facets of the problem with different assumptions. So it's not always straightforward on how to develop an integration, but that's why it's so important to embed it in real cases, as Kalle described, because promising approaches to tackle the challenges emerge from the situation. So that's another tension we're wrestling with. going to situated aspects rather than striving to always make claims of universal applicability, which is the prestigious thing to do, of course, in science. So I think those are just examples of tensions that fuel the challenge of legitimizing this research mode. But I think the urgency basically helps to open doors, and so there is definitely a room for hope. And I think also, well, we need more reflection of how we can legitimize this type of science and approaches to defining quality criteria and criteria for success and how to evaluate this type of science.
Thank you so much. Belinda?
I use the tension of progress and challenge to present, so I'm done.
You're done?
I'm done.
Yeah. Kalle?
Yeah, I actually think that more than ever, I think the scientific community has an important role to play now, because at least we have tools, techniques, and methods to make sense of the world in better ways than just generate stories or belief systems that are not grounded at all. So I think I'm not saying that science provides the truth in any way, but I'm saying that science has tools and techniques and methods for creating understanding that is beyond just guessing. And since we are in a situation now where there's an enormous amount of that going around and creating very, very, very strange ways of looking at reality, I think this is a time where we can play an important role, and where we have an important role from also, I would say, from a normative aspect. If you're really interested in the survival of our species, some people are not, and that may be fine because of course the Earth will and the life will continue. But the question is, will we be around, and under what circumstances will we be around? So, and of course, the hope for us is really to be around up to 10 billion people with dignity in our social relations, and also without killing each other, basically. So I think that's a big challenge, and if we can contribute to a trajectory that increases the likelihood for a more positive future, I think that's the time is now to mobilize that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really nice to hear your reflections. I'm sorry the panel was cut a bit short, and we're going to wrap this up. This was a short introduction to this enormous topic of the intertwined biosphere. You heard a lot of different ways of looking at this. You heard a few perspectives on how these approaches are being integrated in different parts of society, and I think we all have a role to play in ensuring that we can work towards an integrated approach. Many of us, the speakers and myself and the panelists, will sort of linger around here a little bit if you want to ask some questions. But of course, the intertwined biosphere is waiting for us just outside the doors with lots of sunshine and beautiful flowers. I would also recommend you to enjoy that. So thank you everyone for attending this seminar, and hope to see you soon again.
Thanks a lot. It was very nice.
And I was not fair thing with run away.